Hello everyone, welcome to this Bitesize lecture. I'm Alex Carter. I am a philosopher based here at the University of Cambridge. I'm going to be talking today about why AI can never create like a human. In particular, this picks up on themes of creativity theory. It picks up on ideas of AI and the philosophy of mind. But I'm hoping that it's quite accessible. I'm not going to really introduce any sort of deep and difficult ideas that people can't make sense of in their ordinary lives. I'm looking for an applied aspect of philosophy. So there are optimists about AI. There are people who think that AI can be just as creative as human beings, that essentially we're just machines made of meat, and that a machine could just as easily do all the things that we do. I'm a pessimist about AI, but only because I'm an optimist about that meat, about the fact that the meat matters, as one philosopher put it. So I think that human intelligence is distinct from artificial intelligence, or rather that natural intelligence has an edge over artificial intelligence. So my thesis is really broken down into a few different claims, reaching a particular conclusion. As philosophers often do, we think about the premises and how they lead to the conclusion. So the first step is really about assuming that AI is necessarily rule following. Is AI going to be a rule-following system? I'm going to argue that that's necessarily the case. If there are those of you who know more about AI than I do, who can point to an AI that doesn't rely on code or algorithms or binary, then fine. But I'm arguing that any kind of binary system, any kind of logical system, is a rule-based system. The second thesis is that there are certain aspects of natural intelligence, and I'm going to include creativity amongst that are inimitable, that cannot be imitated. You can't imitate them precisely because if you imitate them, you're not doing the thing that the original exponent of that view was doing. They weren't imitating themselves, they were expressing themselves. You can't express yourself by imitating someone else, for instance. Creativity and leadership have these qualities, right? That if you're told how to do them, you're not doing them. So if the world leaders get told how to lead by someone else, then that someone else is the world leader. So my conclusion that I reach is that AI necessarily lacks certain aspects of natural intelligence, in particular creativity. And I put this rather pithily, although it tends to frustrate non-philosophers when I put it this way, because it sounds complicated, it's definitely not. And it's the idea that AI does not think like us, it thinks like we think we think. And just pause on that for a moment, because the idea here is that we don't actually know how natural intelligence works. We don't know what gives rise to natural intelligence. So how can we have replicated it? How can we have programmed that into a system? That's an epistemic point, by the way, as philosophers would put it. That's a limit to our knowledge. That doesn't yet establish what I'm trying to argue. That just simply says we don't know if AI is reflecting our intelligence because we don't know what our intelligence is. But there is a more sort of a deeper point to make there, which is that we are trying to replicate our thinking. That's the goal with AI. We're trying to replicate human-like intelligence. If we met aliens, we might not be surprised if they thought fundamentally differently to us. And there are reasons that I'll come to for why aliens could have different logics to us. But AI has our logic because we've made it so. We've given it that logic. And this is an important point to begin with, because it raises a certain paradox that I call the spontaneity paradox. The spontaneity paradox is one that we're all familiar with. Certainly when I was a kid, I was familiar with this. And I'll tell you a story about my long-suffering mother who had a 7-year-old son who would grow up to be a philosopher, who when told, say thank you for having me, when I left a friend's house, would then immediately say back, well, I can't now because you've just told me to say it. And gratitude is a spontaneous act of thanks. If you're telling me to do it, it's not spontaneous, so I can't really be expressing gratitude. So what that reflects is a broader problem. If I say, be spontaneous, the one thing you can't now do is be spontaneous. Because if you do it because I told you to, that's not spontaneous. And if you ignore my command in order to be spontaneous, you're still doing it in order to be spontaneous because I told you to. So the point is that's a paradox as opposed to a problem. Lots of people make that mistake. They think a problem is a paradox or a paradox is a problem. Problems have solutions. Paradoxes do not. You cannot solve that. You cannot find a way around it. You can't think your way out of that particular paradox. But it is a paradox for humans and AI. I just said, you can't do that. If I tell you to be spontaneous, you can't act spontaneously. But that doesn't mean that you can't act spontaneously. It just means that I can't tell you to do it. So this is the fundamental difference between humans and AI. We can evade the paradox simply by saying to our mothers, for instance, my poor mother, by saying to our mothers, I'm sorry, I'm going to ignore what you just said because I genuinely want to express my own gratitude, and if I do it because you tell me to, I'm not really doing it. Or I could say, I've already done it, right? I can preempt the command by having already done it and say, I already said thank you. So the idea here is that humans can evade it because we don't necessarily have to think our way out of the problem. And this is the issue that humans often face, is that we're often overthinking things. We're often inputting thought when thought doesn't exist. I can prove to you that you don't have to think about every action you perform, because thinking is an action. And if you had to think prior to every action, you'd have to think to think. And then you'd have to think to think to think. And then you'd have to think to think to think to think. So the point is, it can't be that. It can't be. So there must be some things that we just do. So we are acting spontaneously without a thought preceding it. AI is not that. AI must have a thought preceding it because we've given it that thought. So this spontaneity paradox comes into creativity in an interesting way. There is a very often quoted phrase, which is that immature artists imitate, mature artists steal. I often put this instead as saying good artists borrow, great artists steal. Debussy, I think, said once, rules do not make great art makes rules. The idea being that if you're a leader, if you're sort of championing the way, if you're creating new art, if you're breaking through boundaries, you're doing this because then others are going to follow you, rather than because you're following someone else. So the problem here is that imitation becomes the issue now around creativity. If you're imitating, you're not being creative in the right way. And that's an important point to make, because Aristotle famously said, and he's not necessarily wrong to say this, that art is imitating the world, isn't it? If I paint a bunch of flowers, I'm painting the flowers in front of me, and I'm trying to imitate that. There's a representation going on. There's a famous example, of course, of Magritte's pipe, which said underneath it, "Ceci n'est pas un pipe," this is not a pipe. And someone said, of course it's a pipe. Look, it's a pipe. You've painted a pipe. And he said, well, okay, go on, smoke it then. So the point is, the representation is not the thing itself. We understand this about art. It is representational. But the thing about imitation is it could work the other way as well. We could equally say, like Oscar Wilde said, that life imitates art more than art imitates life. The idea being that we find nature beautiful because we've seen nature in paintings and other beautiful scenes, and we think that's how the world should look, and so we impose that upon the world. So it could go either way, but the point is imitation is involved. But what about someone who creates in this kind of pioneering sense that I was talking about before, this kind of unique sense of the great artist who leads? Well, I always think of Jackson Pollock in this regard. And again, he's not unique in this, but his drip paintings were a perfect example of this. He would try not to create, and then he would fail. He had to fail, otherwise he wouldn't have had a painting. But he tried to not lay the paint anywhere on the canvas. So he let the paint fall onto the canvas by itself. He was trying to let the painting create itself. Interestingly, novelists make the same claim. Here at Pace, we have creative writing courses, and some of the creative writers are told, oh, no, you shouldn't direct the story. You should let the plot and character unfold according to itself. My favorite philosopher and theologian, Simone Weil, she argued that that's how the universe was created, through a renunciation by God to allow it to come to be. And whatever you make of that idea, the idea of creation by allowing something else to exist is a particularly powerful one, and it's exactly what's exemplified by Jackson Pollock. But how is that imitated by AI? Imagine giving AI the command, what is it, don't not create. Wouldn't it just negate the double negation? Wouldn't it say, don't not create? Well, I'll create then. So, but no, because that's not what he was trying to do. He was trying to not create, and then he was failing in that endeavor. And if you're looking for a parallel here, again, in literature, you might look for the parallel in suspension of disbelief. If I am reading a novel and there's a protagonist in danger, I don't reach for the phone and call the police, but I do care. I am concerned about the protagonist, but I don't think it's real. But I don't think it's not real. I don't disbelieve it. I suspend that disbelief. Now imagine AI being told that. Suspend your disbelief. It can't, because it would have to then have the thought, oh, then it's real. I better call the police. So this is why this idea of creation can't be replicated. And it's down to our natural natures. It's down to our kind of biological natures. One way in which this comes out is by the phenomenologist Maurice Merleau-Ponty. early 20th century French philosopher. And he said, everything is both manufactured and natural in man, in the sense that there is not a word, not a form of behavior which does not owe something to purely biological being, and which at the same time does not elude the simplicity of animal life and cause forms of vital behavior to deviate from their preordained direction through a sort of leakage and through a genius for ambiguity which might serve to define man. Note how significant that is. He's saying this defines mankind, human beings. It defines us, our ability, our genius for ambiguity. So what is that? Well, the point can be expressed by saying this. If you open my head, you don't find ones and zeros, you find grey mush. Mushier than most, I suspect. But if you opened Leibniz's head, who invented binary, you would also not find ones and zeros, you'd still find grey mush. And somehow out of that grey mush came binary, came ones and zeros. Likewise, George Boole, who invented logic gates, opened his head, grey mush again. Somehow out of this kind of morass of something that's not quite ones and zeros comes ones and zeros, comes a crystallized sense of logic. And this is a definitive point of disagreement amongst philosophers. Is the world logical or is it mush? I haven't got time to go into that here, but essentially what I'm getting at is AI is a crystallized form of logic that we have created ourselves. So it's an act of creation to have brought about AI. And it's wonderful insofar as it goes, but that's as far as it goes. It's logic. It can't go further than that. We can, because we're biological first and logical second. AI is logical first, logical second, logical third, logical fourth. You'll never get out of that system. So one thing that we've got to remember is AI is logical, we're biological, and AI is logical because we've made it so. And that's the fundamental difference between the two entities. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. I hope you found it interesting, and I hope you want to test your natural intelligence by signing up to one of our courses. And if you do, please do look on our website and click the link.